Good afternoon or evening, wherever you are in Australia, as well as those joining us from overseas. It's probably good morning to you. Welcome to this, our second Courting Controversy event for 2021. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Great Eora Nation, where I'm located, and wish to extend that acknowledgement to the local nation where you are located, respecting their elders and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander participants with us. At the Australian College of Educators, we are not an echo chamber. We recognise and value the capabilities of our members as educated professionals, capable of considering different perspectives on issues and forming their own judgments. Hence, we bring together high quality thinkers who each add their own well-considered assessment and judgment on matters and leave you to decide. So today's topic, an age-old one really, schooling a century or more ago only for the elite, in keeping with their standing and for replicating privilege and opportunity. Then schooling made available for all as economies needed adults to populate the factories to drive the economies. As a consequence, the need to keep the children occupied. Then schooling seen as having both economic and social benefits. Well, that's how the rhetoric goes. But what's the purpose now? Has home-based learning and work disrupted or confirmed such notions? And in New South Wales, by the way, the Treasurer encouraging flexible school hours to help the economic recovery. And we're told it improves learning. The best of both worlds. We encourage you to use the chat facility today to pose your questions, but enough from me. Except it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, ACE board member and president and CEO of the Washington-based National Centre on Education and Economy, the incomparable Tony Mackay, to introduce our Courting Controversy question and fabulous lineup of speakers. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Phil. Well, colleagues, it's great to be with you, and I want to welcome our colleagues and friends, and particularly a very warm welcome to a rather remarkable panel of colleagues who are going to lead the conversation. But as Phil has said, we're really encouraging as much participation as possible. We'll be watching the chat, and we'll be making sure that after an opening session in which we lay out some of the arguments, I'm going to ask each of my expert guests to make a pitch around the topic that we have identified and that Phil has just referred to. Just before I come to each of our speakers, our panel members, I think Phil's point about the fact that this is an age-old question, and yet why is it that in the last 12 to 18 months, we have been asking ourselves the question about the purpose of learning in a way that has been more immediate, more urgent, and maybe ultimately more meaningful. And obviously, COVID has been a major driver, but not just COVID. Let's be clear that we are in the midst of a climate challenge of a kind that we have never experienced. We're in the midst of conflict. We're in the midst of poverty. We have got societies that are fractured. So the question about how we might ensure that our learning system could serve to ensure we have social cohesion, economic prosperity, and individual and collective well-being has been the very issue that we have been speaking about day after day and month after month, but certainly in the last 12 to 18 months with a measure of real urgency. So it is a topic where I don't think I've heard so many rewords in the last decade. We've got reinventing, reinforcing, rebuilding, redesigning, reforming. It goes on and on. It's going to be really interesting to hear how this conversation unfolds over the next hour plus. But with that as the challenge, and it is a challenge for our learning system across the globe, but particularly for our own, obviously here in Australia. That's the focus of our attention for today's Courting Controversy. I'm going to ask each of my guests if they might just say a word about themselves. You've got bio notes, and so they've revealed what they're prepared to reveal in writing. The question is what else they might be prepared to share. So, and I'm asking you, Pascale, if you might just model this, because it'll give people a bit of a sense of where you're coming from as you make a contribution after I've gone around the panel and we've done this brief get to know you. So, Pascale, when I look at the CV, it's pretty remarkable. You did have a life before you became Vice Chancellor and President of Swinburne University of Technology, I see. And it's a life that's really interesting because it spans multiple sectors and multiple continents, I might say. So as you think about your own position at the moment in the kind of learning system, would you have a kind of strap line for yourself? Would you have an identifier that you would say, hey, listen, this is what I bring to a conversation like this? By the way, this is a question without notice.
I'd have to kind of say that I'll consider myself the agent provocateur, maybe, or provocatrice, perhaps, because I'm a first in family. And when my parents account for their childhood, it sounds straight like something out of The Misérables. So I'm actually the tried and tested proof that education does open doors, and in my case, provides you with a passport, because just as you said, I haven't got 2 degrees from the same continent, and I've got 3 degrees, therefore I've traveled a bit, but I'm an absolute believer, as well as living proof, of the power of education in transforming lives and opening opportunities. And that is my motto, and that's what I believe in.
That is fantastic. Great. Okay, so Hayley, could you follow that? Again, if you had to try and use a descriptor or an identifier, this is pretty tough.
Well, I think I'm the inheritor of one of the world's oldest continuing cultures, and that we've done this not because of the education system, but in spite of it. And so I think that's how I would identify.
Tell me something, Hayley, just as you think about that, the role that you did play for a number of years with the UN, how did that influence you?
I think what that showed me was that of the barriers that exist to education, some of those barriers don't have anything to do with teachers or curriculum or, some of the things that we see within the system itself. It's the society that surrounds our education systems and the values that are put at the foundation of it.
Yeah.
And so I think, being able to work with young people around the world and have to see education within those different kinds of contexts open my eyes to, actually transforming education here for my mob is, you have to deal with not just the what is the learning itself, the mechanics of it, but the society that really backs it.
Got it. Thank you. Sara, I don't know which hat you might use. You mightn't use any of them. It mightn't be the corporate one or the education one or the consulting one, right? Or the community one. Which hat might you wear to give people a bit of a sense of where you're coming from?
Well, they're not my only hats, Tony. I also was a first in family going to uni. And I didn't know what on earth I wanted to do. I just chose something I liked, which was maths, believe it or not. But that's not really knowing what I wanted to do has followed me through my whole life. So I, a bit like Pascale, have done a lot of different things. I worked in retail when I left uni. Then I went into logistics in a manufacturing company. Then I was a pub manager. Then I did software support. Then I became a lecturer in maths at a dual sector in the UK. Yeah. Then I became a consultant. And then I came to Australia and was running Skills for Australia and so on. So I think I'm coming from the perspective of an employer. I've worked in all different sectors, of then helping education organisations to look at how they're preparing people for work. I became very passionate, having been to university myself, about helping people to find different ways to get great jobs. And that manifested itself in the UK as starting the higher apprenticeship movement there. So an alternative pathway to the university path to get to the same sort of job. And then I brought that over to Australia. So I think I've got a sort of an all-round view from any hat you can think of, really.
That's fantastic. Okay. This Jan Owen, this is going to be fun. I mean, you know, because I know you. But this could be a surprise. Yeah. How would you, can you capture yourself?
Well, yeah, I should probably ask you to do that. Firstly, I'm the only one without a really amazing background, although I do have quite a good background. I would, I was like a child entrepreneur, which is a nice way of saying a school dropout. Because if you drop out, you kind of go and do entrepreneurial stuff for good and evil, and I managed to do both. And so I have a perspective on education and learning, which is, you know, from the kind of autodidact kind of world, and I consider myself kind of still a work in progress. And I feel like that's the real thing that I want to define me as, this kind of I'm still a work in progress, and I hope to be till pretty much the day I die. And I feel like that's very apt for now as well. It's the times that we are in, to be a work in progress and not to try to land and decide and make a decision about I'm going to be this thing or that thing, or I've got to go this path or that path, is actually, you know, holding that place of being in flow and being an autodidact and being a work in progress, I think, is how I would define myself.
It is wonderful. Okay, well, look, here we go. Pascale, I'm going to ask you if you'll kind of try make a bit of a pitch here around the topic. But by the way, don't feel any constraint. I don't know why I'm saying that, because none of you ever would. You'll determine how you're going to tackle this. We did get the benefit of some quotes that you sent us in advance. And the whole purpose was to say, hey, listen, our learning system may be the thing that allows us as humans to actually be able to survive and thrive. Because if we have a look at the way in which we're operating at the moment, there's a lot that we should be really seriously worried about. So if for those of us who want to put a fair bit into the learning system as the way in which we get society, economy, community, right, into the right place. And by the way, I think, Hayley, as you pointed out, my God, why can't we learn, right, from those who have knowledge, right, and understanding? Then this is really the challenge I think we've got. And each of you have got about sort of 5 to 7 minutes. So if you go beyond about 30 minutes, I'll probably say something. So Pascale, launch us into it.
Thank you very much, Tony. So I will restate the provocation of today, which was, is our education system failing to create a cohesive and equitable society and a prosperous economy? And as I think you would expect from an academic, I'm going to dismount that provocation first before I address it. So there is merit, obviously, in examining the premise of the question and interrogating the scope. First, is it indeed the aim of any education system to achieve these objectives? And in the affirmative, are these the only objectives, and are they equally important? For many learners and their parents, individual objectives rather than societal ones might prevail. And indeed, at the heart of the various debates about funding and the corollary question of how to best use taxpayers' money lies the fundamental question of who stands to gain the most, the individual or the collective. And as perhaps is usual in Australian politics, the question is framed as a dichotomy where individual benefit is often pitted against collective gain. So let me start by trying to reconcile those views. What is good for individuals is often also coupled with societal well-being. And while some may argue that improved educational attainment may exacerbate critical thinking and therefore foster debate between holders of various opinions, most of us would agree that literacy, numeracy, and the ability to engage in rational thought is conducive to evidence-based, defendable empirical decision-making that leads to better results. And let's agree also that there is a long way to go yet. When crowds can get spooked by minuscule probabilities in terms of vaccination, and remain blind to catastrophic odds when it comes to climate change. But that is possibly for another debate, or maybe for something that will be teased out with questions later on. So let us posit that beyond individual gain, an education system should also generate societal benefits, reflected and measured in terms of cohesion, harmony, equity, as well as economic prosperity. And so let's examine how it may do so and whether it succeeds or fails in achieving these outcomes. So first, does our education system deliver cohesion? I am not sure that it should. So this is courting controversy indeed. Diversity and plurality of views are, I believe, desirable features of healthy democratic nations. Cohesion is, in my view, has an undertone of homogeneity. And to my mind, this doesn't represent a trait I associate with an ideal society. There is little merit in agreeing with those who already share your opinion. It is how you engage with those you disagree with, which should be the hallmark of a tolerant and open society. And on this one, at the risk of being controversial, I do think our education system tends to try and make us too homogeneous. Under the cover of safety, or because of the fear to offend or trigger, we increasingly adopt a unified set of beliefs, a shared language and narrative, which ultimately may lead us to groupthink and a lack of creativity. It may also, in time, erode our resilience and ability to cope with adversity and uncertainty. But does a lack of cohesion necessarily translate in a lack of harmony? I think not. And harmony comes from the capacity to disagree with grace, debate with respect, argue with conviction, but without anger and without judgment. And in this, I believe education has a key role to play. And our education system should be geared towards this end. Equip people for debate, prepare them for argument, develop logic and analysis as weapons of choice. This is where our focus should be. Now, I agree that equity is an outcome rather than an antecedent of a good education system. And equity comes from even access to opportunities. It is not necessarily an entitlement, nor should it be a lottery. It should be always what one earns when one demonstrates the capacity to do the job, to perform the task, to solve the problem. Do we currently ensure that our education system generates equity? And can it do so when society at large may not permit it? To wit, the aim that we have to ensure that more girls engage in technology. At my previous institution, I worked for years to achieve a miserable result of 19% of engineering students being girls. But the dilemma for me was that most women engaged in that profession leave it after 5 years. What is the point of getting gender equity in the student population if the work environment is so toxic that women will abandon their career rather than put up with it any longer? And finally, to the point of economic prosperity, is there any other form? Should prosperity be defined in economic terms? Prosperous societies pollute more, eat more meat, and therefore destroy biodiversity faster, accumulate manufactured goods more readily, and therefore use and waste natural resources at a faster rate than less prosperous ones. Our education system offers access to more prosperous lives for individuals, but it currently advocates a single-minded pursuit of individual professional success, prosperous futures for some, challenging environment and climate for many. So our education has a lot of ground to cover, and all actors may play their part. For Swinburne, our aim is clear and our focus is sharp. We believe that the future is about technology, but are adamant that people and technology must work together to create a better world. Digital equity is critical for social equity, and our objective is to assist learners to take advantage of what a tech-rich future can offer. By bridging the digital gap for Indigenous learners, by building STEM skills in younger children, by upskilling and reskilling those at risk of being left behind, we want to contribute to a fairer and more inclusive society. By engaging our researchers in a few areas where we can be world leaders and contribute to the creation of entirely new industries in space, medtech, sustainability, we want to solve industry and government challenges and offer the prosperity that comes from the sort of employment and wealth that do not come at the expense of the planet. By engaging with industry, we want to offer our learners the opportunity to move seamlessly between the world of work and the world of study. In this, I believe, we contribute to a more equitable, prosperous, and cohesive society. But we are only a small cog in a larger system that may well still be failing to do so. Thank you.
Pascale, just before I come to Hayley, and then we continue around the table, let me just be clear about something here. The language that you're using, particularly in terms of tolerance, open, harmonious, inclusive, yeah? You would prefer to use that kind of language because you believe that it allows for the kind of pluralism that you want, as distinct from a version of cohesion that you think is what, false, that it doesn't recognize tension, that it doesn't allow for the kind of debate that we need to have in a society. Let me just be clear about that. Particularly, the reason I'm raising it is because the cohesion argument has emerged out of a time where society has become so fractured in many geographies. Yep. Particularly if you think about the implications of nationalism, that in fact people are looking for a way of being able to rebuild society. So how do we have the discourse so that we get your meaning without a misunderstanding?
So cohesion is often equated to a greater degree of homogeneity, normative compliance, which I believe is actually not desirable. I think it is how you cope with differences. It's not how you erase differences.
Well, it's interesting that the Baltic Nordic geography, right, where you might argue that there's high levels of homogeneity. I mean, you can argue this, but it's changing as we know. That served them very well indeed in terms of the way in which they've been able to look after both the individual and the collective. So are you actually having this conversation that you think spans different geographies, different cultures, different political systems? Or are you actually having this conversation in relation to Australia?
Yes, I was thinking about the society that in Australia we are building and contributing to.
Got it. Yep, fantastic. Thank you. This is going to spark things up a bit. Right, okay. Hayley.
Controversy, right?
Exactly. Hayley, over to you. And again, take your 5 to 7 minutes. I'll yell if you're going too far over, okay?
No worries. Well, I think the way I'd like to start off is by actually sharing a bit about my grandmother's story. So my grandmother is a proud Turrumbal and South Sea Islander woman. She grew up in a small South Sea Islander settlement outside of Rockhampton, central Queensland. You know, my family grew up outside of Rockhampton because at the time, Black people weren't allowed to live really inside the city limits. You know, she went to school on horseback, and she finished school in grade 7 because for young, you know, Indigenous kids, that was just the expectation, especially for young girls. There was no expectation to go into further study because you're going to be working as domestic servants kind of thing. And, you know, that's the experience that my nanny had. And so when we think about the provocation of is our education system failing to achieve equity and economic prosperous society, well, yes and no. I think Australia is failing to do this, but the education system is not, because it's been designed that way to be fundamentally inequitable when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. You know, when we think about the first school that was established for Aboriginal people, it was in 1814 in Parramatta. You know, the boats came in 1788, and by 1814, they had the first Aboriginal school up where they were taking children away from their families to educate them as either going into domestic housework or to become carpenters, you know. And so since that kind of time, Indigenous people have had this relationship with the education system where it's been actively trying to assimilate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to remove our culture, to remove our connection to our families, to remove us from our connection to country. You know, the education system, our learning systems have been complicit in that. And this continues today in many different ways. We know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students are being removed at higher rates than when compared to the stolen generations. And when we look at past policies as recent as 2015, you know, we see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, their welfare payments being connected to school attendance. So there are punitive approaches that are inherently oppressive for Aboriginal people still continuing today, and there's a complicitness within our learning systems to that oppression still continuing. And, you know, this has got nothing to do with, oh, what are we going to teach? You know, that's another battle in and of itself. You know, there's the fundamental relationship that Australia has with Indigenous people that has fundamentally been baked into our society, you know, through the notion of terra nullius, through the past policies that have sought to dispossess Indigenous people. And so, yeah, no, I don't think it's failing because it's working as it's being designed. And to get on to economic prosperity, I think education has an important role to educate future generations on this past, so that we can actually change the values we put in terms of what it is required for our economies to scale in a way that protect country, that respect Indigenous people. Because, you know, it's Indigenous people who paid the price for the current economic prosperity of Australia. You know, I'm a Darumbal South Sea Islander woman, and so from Queensland, and Queensland's economy was built from the slave labour of South Sea Islanders that were brought to Queensland that I'm descended from, and it was built off the dispossession of our land and also stolen wages. And so, and if we look at just this year, last year, we see Juukan Gorge, one of the world's most important archaeological sites, blown up to make way for mines. And so again, it's Indigenous people who are paying the price for economic prosperity, you know, whatever that means. And so I think when we look at the future, we have to think about how do we sustain ourselves in a way, but in a way that doesn't come at the expense of already oppressed people. And actually, how do we create new societies where the focus of education is actually to build trust between ourselves? We need a new contract based on trust with Indigenous people. And part of that trust is allowing Indigenous people to self-determine the way that we want our education systems to operate, and to really put self-determination at the heart of any kind of imaginings for Australia's future economy.
Helly, there's already for both you and Pascale a chat conversation going on here, and I won't interrupt Sara and Jan's time, other than because we'll come back to all of these issues. But I do want to just be clear about one thing. People are finding that that their own views are resonating with your argument here that the system is what the system is intended to be. Now, what about consciousness? Is it a consequence of an unintentional, right? Is it the consequence of unintentional, or is it actually you're saying, let's be clear, you need to confront the fact that we are consciously and intentionally designing a system that will not deliver the kind of cohesion, the kind of equity, the kind of recognition that you're talking about. Just sharpen that up for me.
That's really hard to sharpen, but I think it's like a yes and a no, because I think the issue with Australia is that we tried to jump straight to reconciliation without facing the truth of what has happened and actually having the hard conversations in the first place.
Yep.
You know, we haven't dealt with what it means to really be Australian, you know?
Yeah.
And so I feel like there is and the thing that our education system does at the moment, it does give the, oh, well, we didn't know because we aren't teaching it, you know, what happened. So it's kind of giving that way out. But I think we can't keep giving those excuses when we're living in the 21st century and you can have access to this information.
We should have heightened levels of consciousness, yes?
Yeah.
I get it. Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll come back. Sara, I've got no idea where you're going to start on this, but and I dare say you're thinking about that precise question right now. So over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to start from the initial provocation. So when Tony asked me about a quote about, is our education system failing to create a cohesive and equitable society and a prosperous economy, my answer was, well, we can't pin all of it on the education system, but there are some things that we can change within that system that will help us to address those issues for our future generations. So, for example, how about we get the foundations right? How about we play to children's strengths? And how about we remove the either real or perceived divide between academic and vocational education and give people opportunities to get the skills and knowledge that are relevant for the current and future economy? If we can do that for all, then I think we set a really good basis to move through the education and employment system. So if I just go into a bit more detail about those things. So my belief is that education should give people a starter in life and should be the basis from which they decide which path they want to take. That would have to include the basic foundations that underpin all learning. And being a mathematician myself and having taught it to people who came out of the school system absolutely hating it, being frightened of it and thinking they couldn't do it, maths and that sort of basic numeracy has to be one of those foundations, as does, you know, the first language of the country people are living in, digital skills, the fundamentals of science, but then other topics that give people an understanding of ourselves, the world we live in, how we got to where we are now, how we've developed as humans, how we stay healthy and well, and how we express ourselves, like arts and literature and so on. So I would see those as the sort of foundations that everybody should leave the compulsory education system with, that provide them with that foundation, that baseline to move forward. And if you follow that as sort of a guiding principle, then early education, say the 0 to 12, should have the function of not only providing that foundation, but also in the process of that, sparking interest in individuals in what they might want to do in the future, giving them just sort of a passion for something that they're learning about and thinking, that feels like that's my thing and I'd like to explore that a bit more. And that starts out each young person on a pathway into further education or work. So is the education system doing that at the moment? Well, sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't, because the factors that are at play around each young person are very complex. Family factors, the geography, the culture they have been brought up in, the health of them or their family, and the quality of the educational experience all play a part in how smooth a young person's journey is through education. So you might have all of those ingredients there, but they're all impacted by the other things going on in everyone's life and the type of support network people have. So you can try to get that right, but you're not always going to manage that unless you really understand the person. And Pascale, coming to what you were saying about homogeneity, individualizing this approach, it's not the same, all the same for all people. you're not going to, even if you have an education system that's identical, you're still not actually going to end up with individuals coming out of it identical, because they experience it in a different way. So I think we often fall prey to forcing more and more content into the school curriculum in an effort to give everybody all the things we think they need. So that just puts teachers under pressure to deliver sort of the bare bones, teach to tests because they're measured on that. And, you know, having people coming out with a seeming success is the thing that, you know, people are, the metrics that are at play in the education system, certainly at school and further on. But perhaps we can better prepare our young people by giving them the tools that they need to investigate, collaborate, analyze, and all of those sort of activities. And then they can use that toolkit to explore many different subjects. We don't have to teach them absolutely everything about each of those subjects. We have to give them the ability to explore them, give them the basics, and then see where they can go with that. So that's one of the things that I think we can change about the education system that will help to create a more inclusive, more equitable system as well. At most schools, just moving on slightly, academic study is the main focus, but only 49% of young people actually progress to an academic pathway, and even less than that succeed in that pathway going forward. So we really need to break this perception that is still hanging around in schools, in parents and so on, that the academic pathway is superior to vocational study. They are equally valuable. And a lot of people that I have come across in all sorts of walks of life have felt pressured to go down that academic pathway because it's the best one. Because unless, you know, if you're not very clever, maybe you could go down the vocational route, but it's not like that at all. It shouldn't be. We do need some people to follow an academic pathway and get higher education, specialize and push the boundaries of research and take us forward in science and so on. But we also need a lot of people to follow more practical routes and more vocational routes, not just in things like trades, but increasingly in areas like nursing and accounting and, you know, all sorts of things. You don't have to do that university route because it doesn't suit everybody. We need this mix to have a functioning economy, but we are badly neglecting the vocational aspects. Yep. Because of that perception. Yep. Finally, I think we need to make a call on what we invest public money in terms of both study and research. I know that's not an exact science, predicting what the jobs of the future are going to be, but I do think we need to make sure we're equipping young people with a set of knowledge and skills that optimizes their choice of pathways into work, economic freedom, and personal fulfillment throughout their lives. And I'm not sure that we're currently doing that in every case.
Sara, let me just ask you one question as Jane comes in, and that is, do you feel that there is the potential for the future of learning and the future of work to reinforce each other in a really powerful way? In other words, that this old head-hand dichotomy, this differential status, for anybody that wants to have a look at what is happening within our economy, what is happening with technology, what's happening in an AI world, right? Quite apart from the extreme inequities that we are dealing with, that Haley has identified, and perhaps the misguided notion that we should be trying to create some kind of cohesion of a particular order, which Pascale has raised. But surely, are you optimistic now that we look as if we might be able to get a learning system that can serve people constantly thinking about how they can learn a living in a very different work environment? Yeah. What's your sense about that?
So, I mean, I focused on sort of the start of an educational pathway, but to be honest, the educational pathway now is going to last your whole lifetime.
Yeah.
Your future of work and future of learning, they're actually the same thing now, because you're gonna change jobs change, technology changes. You're gonna have to keep picking up all these new skills and knowledge all the way through. There is no, I mean, I've used the term compulsory education. I think compulsory education lasts till you die now. That's basically it. Your whole future is about learning and changing and adapting and moving on. So we have to integrate those two things. And one of the things I was going to talk about, if I didn't decide that I'd run out of time, was transitions. we're very bad at transitions from primary school to secondary, secondary to vet or uni, uni or vet to work. They're terrible. That's where most people fall through the cracks and don't have a good experience. We have to get that right, because our entire lives are going to be a transition.
Yep. Jan.
I love what everyone said, and I've nearly forgotten what I was going to say, but I think that I just want to take it to the kind of just one more lens, Tony, on this kind of reality. And I don't really want to talk about the education system, because I think what we're fundamentally questioning in Australia and globally is what we mean by coherent and equitable society and prosperous economy. Now, of course, education is one of the institutions under that umbrella called society, but until we have a much better sense about, in the 21st century, what do we mean by and what do we expect in a coherent, equitable society and prosperous economy, I don't think we can really talk about education very well. We can talk about it at the margins and we can mess around with it at the margins, but we can't center it. Yeah. So I think centering this kind of decade of transformation, so this is literally the decade of all decades. So nobody go on holidays, nobody go on long service leave, you know, nobody leave your job. This is kind of it. If we don't transform a whole range of really, really wicked problems and get to solutions around climate, around the geopolitical instability that we're experiencing, around inequity and inequality, and around the future of work, if we don't come to some new frameworks around all those things, which are what will constitute our new society, it doesn't really matter what we do with education. So what we do know is that young people will inherit these issues, and they will have to deal with them globally, which again, apart from wars, and now we've got pandemics, there's very little, I think, precedence for this, for an entire generations having to deal with these big issues together. It hasn't been the case. So I think traditional education is being questioned, and rightly so in that context, not because it's bad, or not because it's terrible, or it's more that is it what is required as we now move forward. And one of the people I love at the moment is Mariana Mazzucato, our favourite kind of economist globally. And, you know, she starts to dig deep on this stuff, right? And she talks about things like the characteristics of solutions now. So let's get to that level. Let's start to think about the frameworks, the platforms, the characteristics. So she says the equitable society is public, it's transparent, it is institutional. Of course it is. It's built off institutions. It is democratic and it is universal. Not that it's the same for everyone, but it has the ability to go to the root of a problem, or and think about solving for everyone, not just some. And I think about that a lot, because I think about in our society, the three biggest issues that we have then against that backdrop are trust, lack of trust, lack of leadership, lack of real understanding of how culture drives the decisions people make and the changes that people make and the things they do. We have this real misalignment around the kind of rhythms and assumptions of education and the rhythms and assumptions of the future of work, as you say, Tony, as it is ever evolving, and as Sara says. Yep. And that there's a pace and intensity in that that is actually genuinely hard for us to get our heads around. So we should accept that and try to work with that and not try to work against it. And that leads me to this kind of idea of, you know, this future fusion, as Sara says, of what we would call learning in the flow of work. Actually, we can now stop talking about reskilling and upskilling. Done. This idea of learning in the flow of work, learning in the flow of school, learning in the flow of work, learning in the flow of, and this is the work we're doing at Learning Creates Australia, of course, at the moment, is how on earth might we recognise everything that young people know and do and have got deep in their DNA from their lived experience, how might we recognize that, yes, more formally, but as a way to acknowledge and accept and honor and celebrate the diverse people that we have in our communities and their experiences. And so this kind of recognition of whole people, and then this idea about how might we all learn in the flow of work for the rest of our lives, is a very, very, very important issue. And then finally, I would say, you know, I do think that our future, and I'm only really interested in the future learning system that we create, will have to have built in this idea of mistakability and failure. That will have to be baked into it, you know, that we are allowed to fail and make mistakes and learn as we go, as we're creating and building a kind of a new way of learning and a new kind of education system that goes way, way, way beyond the bounds. So I feel like there's a lot of us who can see this. I just don't know that we have enough opportunities. And this is why it's fantastic to have people like Pascale here, and also the work that Hayley's doing, and Sara actually kind of at an institutional level, but the opportunities to genuinely have people in places that are willing to build mistakability into the things that are doing and build this idea of experimentation and allow ourselves to genuinely go through the most uncertain times with eyes wide open, but with some, you know, genuine rigor, as well as kind of experience. Yeah, I think agility and experimentation. That's sort of, I'm really interested in who those people are, where they are, and how they will give ballast to each other as we're forging the kind of new society and the new economy.
Yep. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, I'll tell you what. Before we go to the chat, and I've got 3 or 4 big issues that have emerged, let me just give you the opportunity. Who wants to respond to who? So in other words, from what you've heard from each other, you've already made the connections, but do you want to immediately come back on a couple of these themes yourselves just before we start to tackle them through the contributions that are being made on the chat? Pascale, do you want to have a go?
Yes, just to say how refreshing it is to hear my colleagues talk about this, the risk of dichotomizing things. So Sara talked about, why are we making vocational and higher education 2 different things? They are, if you take a learner-centric point of view, it is about scaffolding the education that is needed when it is needed. When you hear Hayley talk about the fact that putting people aside is fundamentally harmful, because it does create that sense of differentiation that is not useful. You know, we really need to embrace the fact that dichotomizing is not helpful. And the last point I wanted to make is that this notion of learning by doing, which is what Jan has been talking about, happens to be what we have recognized at Swinburne as being absolutely part of a quality education. It has to be what builds future learners, is the capacity to learn by doing, mastery through practice. We believe in that.
Okay, let me just challenge one thing here, because this has definitely come through. People are saying that we are not wanting as educators to become social engineers, right? In other words, we are not saying that we should have the responsibility of educators of being the creators of the new society and economy that we think is going to be a more hospitable, healthy, human enhancing, right, world. But they're also saying, hold on, if you're talking about forging a new society, Jan, if you're talking, Hayley, about new levels of consciousness, and Sara, if you're talking about a break in the way in which we thought, you know, the schism is not just head-hand, the schism has been, you know, arts and science. I mean, like, it's just, they're saying, hold on, who is going to be forging? And surely we have to learn ourselves out of the situation we're in and learn ourselves into, right, a new way of thinking about, to use your language, Pascale, a harmonious society, right? Now, hold on, they're not saying we should do that as educators. It's not our responsibility. We can contribute. But I have to tell you, a number of people don't have that much faith in government to do it. So therefore, Jan, let me put you on the spot. What kind of leadership? You said we need trust, leadership, and culture to come together in powerful ways to help us to redesign the very way in which we in society go about, right? Living and learning. Well, whose hands are you putting it in? Whose leadership? So Jane,
it may not be you as educators, but it's definitely going to be us as citizens. I mean, we don't have any other choice. So it doesn't, you can take off your educator hat and be a citizen in this, and we will be, and we will make decisions. We've got a generation who absolutely now make decisions with their wallet. 97% of Gen Zs will spend their money, and they've got quite a bit of it in some areas, in some contexts. They will spend their money on businesses that they think are doing the right thing, and they will absolutely cancel businesses that they don't think are doing the right thing. So just watch the rise of that. They're still only 6 to 22 years of age, that group, but we're seeing massive trend lines at 14 years of age now for that group. So let's just be really, really, really clear that as citizens, we are going to make decisions. We're going to make decisions with our vote. We're going to make decisions with our money. We're going to make decisions about community that we have not actually made previously, but COVID has actually accelerated our rethinking how we live and work, and where we live and work, and in what ways we live and work, and how family and how extended family and how neighbourhoods are being reimagined and reconstructed. So for me, we've waited a long time, always in previous generations, for the top to come down and sort it, and now we're seeing the resurgence of the local coming up, and I think that's a really powerful outcome of COVID, amidst some terrible outcomes of COVID, that we need to capture, and we need to understand that and build on that.
Well, Hayley, let me just pick, there's a couple of points that have been picked up here, and I think it goes to this very point about community. You said, hey, listen, you guys, you leapfrog over, right, a deep understanding, right, by thinking about how we get to reconciliation without going through levels of deep understanding. Yeah. Now, but you talked now about self-determination. So what can we learn as communities? I hear a lot of people saying what Jan's saying, that we are learning our way out of our wicked problems through participative democracy, through the engagement of ourselves as citizens, not through some, set of institutions that are connected to a central government. Well, when you talk about the local, when you talk about community, you have an incredibly deep meaning attached to that. Are we talking the same language here?
Well, I think there's so much that we can learn, even just over the past 30 years, around like the grassroots efforts that have come out of a need for survival from Indigenous people. And, a lot of, if we take just Aboriginal community controlled health services as an example, Aboriginal community controlled health services in the 70s pioneered patient-centered care ahead of the World Health Organization, and that's now become part of the primary model of healthcare that's delivered within our mainstream system. That came about because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people recognized that we weren't being included within the mainstream systems, that we had a unique way of wrapping around and caring for people that was holistic, that valued who they are, where they're from, their deep sense of spirituality, and that became the new model that we just take now as a given. So when I think about self-determination, when it comes to the economy, I believe in having a First Nations-led education system, first and foremost, that is community controlled, that respects, the need of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to protect and hold on to our culture and languages and to revive that. So I don't know if that counts as like separate kind of, that's how I see it. But I think within that becomes the recognition that you can have a learning ecosystem that is responsive to the needs of local communities, that's driven, you know, based on the needs of local communities, and that respects, you know, that uniqueness, that richness that's at the grassroots. That's yeah, that I think is so valuable and important.
Well, I want to ask Pascale in a moment something that's also coming up around, are we just having completely separate conversations in this country and talking past each other? And what is the responsibility of further and higher education and the responsibility of the corporate world to be thinking about how we create, reforge, to use your language, Jan, right, a society and an economy that's going to be human-centered, right, that is going to allow us to ensure that the values that we are talking about, right, to become whole human beings, first-class human beings, not second-class robots, as people say. Are we talking past each other? Sara, let me just ask you this question. Is this conversation taking place, and I'm asking you to speak on behalf of the entire corporate world. I mean, I hear about triple bottom lines and quadruple bottom lines, and I hear about social responsibility, and I take the point that Jan's raising about where the investment is going. Are we really getting higher levels of consciousness within corporate Australia, right, about the need to forge again a different kind of society and economy in order to survive?
I would say, in my experience, yes. I think something really, as Jan said, some terrible things have happened during COVID, but some really amazing things have also happened. And as an employer during that time, I think, and I will speak on behalf of my people that I was working with at the time, I think we became much, much more conscious of every individual we worked with, what they were going through, their needs, their mental health, their environment, because we were all going through difficulty together. And because I was a leader, I was very conscious of that, much more so. I mean, I always cared about my team, I always looked after them and so on, but this was different. This put a really sharp focus on it. And I think we've all learned to think about things, to think about everybody we are involved with, whether it's family, whether it's friends, whether it's colleagues, and what they're going through. And I genuinely think that's changed the way we think about what we do, how we deal with other people, how other people are coping with their lives. And it's put a different, I don't know, I think it's just made us a lot more conscious about each other and how we work together as an ecosystem, as a nation. So that's one thing. Just one other thing that I wanted to say was Jan's word mistakability, which is a new word to me. I've never heard it before. I think one of the other things implicit in your question, I think, Anthony, is about role models and how we set examples for each other about the way, you know, about society, about the way we work together, about the way we live. And mistakability has to be one of the most important things that we can make okay for young people, because I feel like there's a lot of pressure on everybody to be perfect, to never put a foot wrong, to never make a mistake, because if you do, you're going to be slammed, you're going to fail, you're going to whatever. But actually, in the future, or as we move further into the future, we are going to, none of us can possibly hope to keep up with everything that's going on. We can't possibly be perfect at everything we do. We're all learning, we're all going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
And I want to get rid of that thing that is a bad thing. It's going to be a natural consequence of the pace that we're moving at as a society. And we have to make that acceptable.
Okay, well, I want to come back to the question because other people are raising it. They want to come back to what is the responsibility of we as educators. I want to come back to that. But first, Pascale, let me broaden it a little bit more, though, because when you speak, you are speaking on behalf of a university, right? It happens to be dual sector, with strong connections into industry, strong connections into community, right? So in a sense, you are taking responsibility for the way in which learning is taking place and how that infuses, right, the lives of young people as they move through learning constantly and work. So surely the university is taking a stance on this.
Well, as I said, I think in my 5 minutes, we definitely are a cog in that system, but we are by definition inheriting, the learners who come to us with a particular set of capacity for argument, for analysis, and we don't want to kind of come to this from a deficit model. We're not there to remedy what has not been done in school. We're there to add value, and we are there to expand. We are the horizon stretchers, right? And this is our job. And what I think is great about an institution like Swinburne is the dual sector is actually not just about young learners alone. It is the education partner of a lifetime. I think we've all spoken about that in some ways, that only delivering a degree at the early stage of people's lives is good, but it's nowhere enough. And the future as we see it will demand this kind of just-in-time education, the stuff that is available when I want it, where I want it, in order for me to do as I wish. I mean, and that's the point I was making. We can build a better world one person at a time. And it is this kind of, overwhelming task and duty that we all have to make sure that everybody is a little bit more educated, a little bit more informed, a little bit more rational in terms of tackling the challenges ahead.
Okay, let me here, Jan, you're going to love this. There's 3 statements I'm now going to read out, and any of you can respond, but here's the first one. This whole premise is flawed, which, by the way, I think many of you have said as much, right? It assumes that our system wants to create a cohesive, or even, Pascale, I'll use more of your language, open, tolerant, harmonious, right? An equitable society. Would the panel comment on government policies which deliberately increase the equity gap and privilege particular socioeconomic groups? So, Jan, how would you like to have a go at the fact that government is acting in ways that are deliberately intended not to forge the new society that you're referring to?
Why did I get that question? Thank you, Tony. Well, I like to go from evidence. So we are the 4th most inequitable system in the whole world in education. Is it still 4th, Tony? Or
yes, it is.
Have we moved up that?
No, we're still at that level.
Auspicious ladder.
Yep.
Okay, so we're still
the OECD data. Yep.
Yeah, they were still the 4th most inequitable. So I think the question is a very, very, very good question as to what is it that we have done or have created over the last 25, 30 years. I don't know what the time frame is. I think somebody dropped in 60 years of kind of the system that we've got now in Australia. What have we done that has resulted in that outcome?
Yep.
And what must we be doing now that we know? Because you can't say that you didn't know if you then know, and the data is very clear and the evidence is clear. I think there's elements to it. One element is very clearly what Hayley has been talking about. So inequity, just in terms of actually institutional, baked in institutional inequity around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Yep. And then obviously a much broader issue around a system that is not equitable, that does not actually focus on what people need around what are absolutely systemic issues of poverty, yep, of race, and all the things that we know. So these are not unknowns. Everyone on this webinar knows that these are not unknowns. So the issue is, what are we doing about it?
So therefore, it's interesting that some are saying, well, thank God young people are in fact doing something about it, Jan, right? In other words, if there is, as there is, systemic racism and structural inequity in this country, yep, and if it's true that government hasn't been able to address that in anything like the way that would shift those metrics to the extent that we want, people are saying, well, hold on, we're not going to wait around. Young people are not going to wait around, right, for that change. So, Hayley, let me be clear about this. Are you increasingly of the view that action at the local community level, right, will shift these metrics? Have you got a sense that you're not going to be waiting? You obviously want institutions to support. You want government to support. You want leadership to support. You want to get growing trust, which is what people have been saying here. But have you got a measure of optimism that we are going to be able to shift these metrics?
I think I'm optimistic because, well, because part of my role with the Indigenous Youth Education Coalition has been going around and talking to young people around what they see as the future of education, you know, and young people that we've been talking to know what they want, and they know that you know, we can self-determine what education could look like. We have a right to that. But I think part of the issue that always comes back to it is like, how do you kind of scale what, you know, is the good work that happens at the local community level, so it is accepted as like the best kind of practice. And I think we also have to keep coming back to like, who profits from inequity. You know, we do have major power holders in this country who are comfortable and actually want the current ways, current systems to operate the way it does. You know, like I said, you know, the example of Juukan Gorge, you know, there was no, what was the reprisal to Rio Tinto for doing that? You know, there was no real legislative or any kind of reason apart from like the small PR kind of crisis that meant that they should not do that ongoing. In fact, you know, the government has just chipped in an extra 50 million to help expand fracking in the NT. You know, so like there are fundamental kinds of, I think, yes, there's the goodwill, there's the activism that happens at the grassroots, but unless we look at who continues to gain from the status quo and focus on challenging those things, that's also what we need. And
Okay,
I think it comes back to education. Who benefits from the way that education currently happens? Well, tertiary sector does benefit from the way that education is currently structured, because it is structured towards a tertiary pathway.
Well, I do want to come back. So, Haley, this is good. I do want to come back to the question about our learning system. Yeah, and I understand entirely the argument we've been having about the fact that this is a whole of society conversation, right? And I understand, Jan, your point about citizenry that takes on this responsibility through its community and through its representative engagement, right, in governance, right? And that we have got governments that we can hold to account. Yep. So we can push this agenda in ways that are highly desirable. But I want to come back to the question about we as educators and we as educational institutions. And when I say that, Sara, I want to include you here, because we are not, I'm wanting to think about everything that includes all of our learning systems at different phases, and the world of work that we have said is the place where learning, what was it, Jan, continues to flow, right? It's all of a piece. Let me put this to you. The purpose of learning is human flourishing. That's the purpose of learning. We have to flourish as a human species. Jan said, this is the decisive decade. You've got a choice. You can come to an end, right? Or you can survive and then flourish. If you're going to flourish, the argument, Pascale, is you better develop adaptive expertise. You better develop ethical decision-making. You better develop complex problem-solving capacity. Who's going to actually develop those kind of capabilities so that, in fact, we can forge this new society and economy, if not educators taking a major responsibility? Surely you are taking a major responsibility, Pascale. Sara, your work, you are wanting to take a major responsibility. I just want to be clear about relative responsibility here. So Pascale, help me out.
Well, I mean, I agree. We all have a collective responsibility, and all parts of the education system, from school to you know, the vet sector, the higher education sector, and then beyond that, in the world of work, I think there is always an imperative for allowing people to grow, develop, and adapt. This is something that can only be, and that's what the question is about the system, right? So you need to actually have a sense of direction which is shared and collective. One of the things that I like to do the most is talk to schools and talk to employers, because to me this is about the person. And the person needs to flourish and transition. I think we heard, it needs to be around the learner, always.
Sara, is this is this conversation, do you think, in the quarters that you move in, right, emerging now as a really potential breakthrough from the old, to use Pascale's language, the old dichotomies, right? Have we seriously got an understanding that we are going to be forging a new economy, a new society, and we will need to have a learning system that's adequate to that? What do you reckon? Is that the conversation that's taking place?
I think more and more people are talking about how we better prepare those who are entering the workforce with the skills they need to be able to do jobs, right? And they're not necessarily technical content. They're much more about, all the things that people talk about all the time: teamwork, communication, being able to analyze problems, triangulate things so you know what's true and what isn't true, all that sort of stuff, right, as the foundations. But equally, I was going to just talk about this from a perspective of an employer. A lot of people think that what keeps employees in your workforce is paying them more money, but actually that only becomes a factor when people are really, really unhappy and everything else has been exhausted. What most people want, young people entering the workforce now, is somebody investing in them, thinking about their development, enabling them to have, new experiences, learn new things. So that education aspect follows all the way through, because people have a thirst for learning. They want to, have a new challenge. That's what keeps people going. So I think it's really important that we recognize that already learning doesn't stop in an education institution. It's what really keeps people motivated and fulfilled and flourishing all the way through their lives. One of the other things, though, that I think is really important is social mobility. And that's not a term that I hear a lot in Australia, but I have worked a lot with that in the UK. This notion that, as an organization, whether you're a corporate, whether you're a government, whatever, what you're trying to do is enable everybody, no matter what their background, to have the most fulfilling life and fulfill their potential. And in the UK, that is measured quite dramatically. And everybody uses the same measures now. And everybody can see how they're progressing on this pathway and report against it. And I think we don't have that same focus. We don't have that common set of metrics that enables everybody to say, am I doing the best I could be doing in helping to create a diverse and inclusive workforce, society, economy, whatever. And I'm not necessarily saying we should adopt that model, but I think we should really seriously think about how we create that more coherent way of looking at this and a pathway forward.
Well, tell you what, this is really fascinating, because you've hit on a theme that's coming through here. On the one hand, people are saying, listen, can we be clear about the nature of learning? It's not just formal, it's informal, non-formal. It's your point about, and Pascale, I've heard you talk about this, and certainly Jan and Haley, all of us at Learning Creative Australia have been talking about the importance of a learning ecosystem, and absolutely the importance about not just formal, but that goes to the second point, which is your point about metrics. And Jan, you've already raised this question about the fact that surely we're going to have to get a shift in the recognition system of what we value, how we think about and talk about success, which is what all of you talked about at the opening. So just in order to bring this back to a kind of point that I thought was a moment where we're all saying to each other, listen, if we can't recognize what we see as being really important and valuable, right, in the development of us as humans, and if we can't do that through our learning system, and we can't give account of that, right through to metrics that might help us, Sara, in the way that you're talking about, i.e. we want to progress social mobility. There's all manner of this, Where are we on that? Because there's some sense at the moment in this country that we're on the move. So Jan, help us out on this. Do you think we are on the move? And I'll get each of you to quickly comment on this, that we're getting a new set of measures that we might ultimately get ourselves to a far better position about what we see as being the recognition of important learning and how we actually have a broader definition of success, not some narrow definition of excellence? Are we moving?
Well, I think we need to look at what indicators would tell us that we're moving. One indicator that tells us that we're moving is students themselves. So as someone earlier, I think Sara said, and Swinburne know this better than anybody, because you're offering pathways directly from school, bypass, it's the bypass we call it, the bypass option directly into university. If you can tell us and demonstrate what you know, what you can do in a diverse variety of ways,
yep.
With or without an ATAR. Now that's something like 48% of our students are doing that right now. So let's look for kind of the signals, weak and strong signals, Tony. So that is a very strong signal, because
yep.
if you get a student bypass, I think that's a very strong signal. We've also, because of this broader conversation about what is the purpose of education and learning, is it deep and broad enough to be fit for purpose for the future of the world and our role in it? Because there is one thing we do know, and this is actually, again, I think a strong evidence, as evidence around this panel, except probably for me, that education and learning really does give you a greater sense of agency in life. And if you have a greater sense of agency in life, you are more able and more willing to step forward and step up and step into the good, the bad, the ugly, all the things, because you've got that kind of foundation behind you. And then if you were to see that
yep.
this was an ongoing thing, and that you're going to do this in flow and not in stop starts and not in strange formal institutional ways, you would start seeing some very strong signals as well from the market, both from employers and from young people themselves, I think. So I think we are on the move, Tony, and I think there's plenty of strong and weak signals yep. around us and in the work that we're all doing. And also, I think one of the things that we keep talking about, I heard again today, is parents are a big barrier. And so school communities, let's not hone in just on parents, but let's think about the school as a community. And I heard a lot on the chat, I was reading on the chat about educators being vilified for kind of pushing some yeah. ways of thinking and doing. A strong school community should actually have each other's back. And so we're very interested in, again, that ground up, what actually constitutes a strong school community in your context. It'll be different everywhere. And how do you give your whole the autonomy that you actually have and you require to be responsive to your situation?
Okay, in a moment, I'm going to ask each of you if you'll give me a kind of high-level takeaway from this conversation, given the fact that in the spirit of we had a topic and we've either argued that it's the wrong premise, or we've argued that in fact it needs to be amended, or we've argued that in fact we have got a very much bigger debate here, right, to put our arms around. But just before I ask each of you to give your final word, I do want to pick up on your reference to Pascale. Pascale, do you think that we are starting to see a move within the further or tertiary education sector and its relationship with industry that is wholly supportive of a new set of metrics? I don't mean every institution, I'm just talking about, do you feel a move?
I think so. We can see it from employers saying we don't actually want people with degrees. We want human capital who can actually fit in and be valuable within our community. I mean, Deloitte will actually say that what they want is young people who have had a range of experiences, and well, yep. if they finish the degree, all well and good, but it's actually yep. not that critical. So it's that notion of building human capital in every possible ways, and in a way that actually would mean that sometimes a person may choose not to have an employer. They might choose to actually go and create their own business, and then they will have employees of their own. And that element of choice, I think that's the to me the red thread in our conversation, which is about a good education system gives people choices, and then after that they do with it as they will. And we should not be judgmental, and we should not be dogmatic. Their choice is actually the fruit of our labor and the measure of our success.
I love that. I'm going to take that as your high-level message.
Yes,
and I think the choice marries beautifully with the agency. Yep. Okay, but 30 seconds each. Sara, if you had to give a kind of a takeaway here, a message that you've come to as a result of this conversation, is there one?
Well, I was expecting you to ask Hayley first, but anyway, and Pascale's basically said what I was going to say, which is, I think the whole thing is about giving people the foundations such that they can follow the most fulfilling life that they can, that they want to. And that will naturally lead them, hopefully, to be, economically sustainable themselves, contribute to a thriving economy, and feel part of society and have agency and have a voice. And I think if we can prepare people like that, and I did see a comment about, we've talked a lot about school and onwards, and I do believe that the job of early education is to help people find their spark and excite them about their future one way or another. I think if we can keep doing that as well, then we're on a road to success. But I also do believe employers need to set examples, need to show leadership, and contribute to that social mobility agenda, because that, if you do it from both ends of the spectrum, then you're helping people progress in the way that they want to on their pathway.
Yep. Hayley.
Yeah, I think I'd like to see that our schools are just essential parts of our communities, and that young people see education as a way to get grounding and connection, not only to who they are, what they want to do, but to where they live, to the people that surround them, and that their responsibility to the future of this country and our region. And I think centering the importance of connection to all things is an important part of where that future of education needs to go. And I think my challenge to everyone watching, that yes, young people have an important part to play, but that it's really our responsibility to act right now, and to act with a long-term vision around what is it that we want our future generations to inherit. 7 generations, 500 years, however you view time, 500 years from now, what do you want our country, what do you want the world to kind of look like? And how does learning play an essential part within that?
Wow, it's so powerful. That whole concept of time. Don't mortgage the future in favor of the present. Yeah, we've got a really big issue. Jan, finish us off.
Thanks. Meg Wheatley talks a lot about the kind of foundations of the new are built on these relationships, and the power of relationship, the power of the informal as well as the formal system. And so if we were debating, I'd probably come back to Pascale and say, I think human capital is probably not where we're heading. It's probably more about social capital and how we're going to build that social capital and those kind of those webs of connection and people who are going to need to work very, very, very differently together. And I see collaborations more than I see partnerships, which are transactional. I think the entire language is going to change. And I think education is at the heart of it, to be honest, Tony. I think the idea that we are all learners. So I think the biggest shift that we will make across all generations is that we are all learners. So we are all in the learning zone all the time, and bringing that mindset will give us the best chance.
Thank you. Leela.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. The Courting Controversy series is an extremely unique and provocative set of forums, and tonight has absolutely lived up to its namesake. So I just want to begin by thanking you, and I'll be doing that for the next few minutes. These forums are focused on discussion, on thinking, on challenging our views, our practice and our perspective. And you have done that. You've invigorated us intellectually and emotionally, which is just wonderful. We haven't been disappointed. I'm sure that most of us, and there are hundreds of us online, will be dissecting and digesting, because I haven't digested everything you've said, the whole ecosystem of concepts that you presented tonight for a long time. So thank you so much for that. But as everyone online knows, these forums are actually facilitated by the Australian College of Educators, the ACE, and I'll just speak about that for a moment, which happens to be the oldest and the only fully sustained and fully inclusive, that is P to tertiary learners, with all educators, all sectors, all states and territories, education association. So that's who we have online listening to our wonderful panel. So thank you. Nowhere else in Australia can any other association lay claim to that inclusivity, which is part of the equity issue and the accessibility issue. Just trying to tie it in. But in part, I guess the benchmark of success of tonight's panel is going to be staged in many ways for many of our colleagues online. And it's going to be about the conversations that the hundreds of you are going to have tomorrow, as I will be with my colleagues, about what we've heard today. Importantly, it's going to be about the formal conversations and professional learning. I've already had multiple texts from networks that I'm in. We've got to do this now, Lila. What about blah, blah, blah? So I know that it's already cascaded out, which is great. The Twitter sphere, it's going to be going into overdrive, and that's where more ideas will be ignited, if not inflamed. So that's something, but that's also been mirrored in the Q&A facility and the chat facility as well. And we can't get to everything, but it has certainly inspired much discussion. But it's also inspired reflection, I guess, on our own story and our own positions of belief and demonstrative behaviour, which is really important. And therefore, I think there will be lots of reflection on what we do and if we need to change in practice or action, or what we pursue for the students, for the learners, and for the colleagues in our care, and much broader in our sphere of influence, which is really important and part of the broader policy that you've all been not alluding to, bluntly stating, which is really important. Now, as Tony said, the panel has dismantled, deconstructed, reconstructed, reframed the provocation, which is fabulous. For that and everything that you have professionally and personally shared, we would like to thank you, panel. And it's a pity you can't hear us all applauding, but you certainly deserve it. So thanks to Jan Owen, Professor Pascale Cuesta, Sara Caplan, Hayley Maguire. Your knowledge, your evidence, your capacity, your compassion, your capacity to synthesize, etc., 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 is absolutely appreciated. May I also now acknowledge Helen Gents, our Managing Director at the ACE National Office, who actually brings these events to life. And I know that we're all on screen, but someone is doing that mean feat behind the scenes, often an unsung achievement. So thank you, we acknowledge you, Helen. And of course, thank you, well clapped, Tony. We'd like to also acknowledge and thank our expert moderator, Tony Mackay. Now, when it looks effortless, you know you're in the hands of a master in action. So that's amazing. But now, as one forum closes, because I have to tell you, they only gave me 3 minutes. I did request 30, wasn't on the cards. But as one forum closes, another is anticipated. And this is where I get to announce our next topic. Schools need to be ready for children, not children ready for school. And let me repeat that. Schools need to be ready for children, not children ready for school. Another provocation for our input and for our great learning. Please check the ACE website for this and many of the other opportunities that you have. I want to thank the panel, but I also want to thank all our attendees and participants. As I said, there are hundreds of you. Great. And thank you for your contribution, attendees, to our profession and to the learning systems that we've referenced that we need to dismantle, deconstruct, reconstruct and reframe. Thank you all so much and good evening to you.